Welcome to another Dreammakers 365 internet radio show. And again, you might be wondering or asking the question, why Dreammakers 365? Well, there's three answers to that quickly. Number one, this show is set up and devised as a mission to give voice to the voiceless, also to discuss African American history. And if I had my way, we'd do it, as we said, 365 days a year. And lastly, we want to help save people's lives, encourage people. And we're talking one or two at a time, or if we can do that by sharing the hope through Jesus Christ. We want to also share with you that our sponsor, who will be here tonight, of course, on this show, is Mr. Martin Casey. He's the president of My Fuller Products. And without him helping us financially, there will not be a Dreammakers 365 talk show. And again, we are going to be celebrating Black History tonight. Our persons of the week will be various businessmen and women throughout this land, past and present, we will talk about. But our topic tonight, after we talk about these wonderful businessmen and women, we need to deal with the issues surrounding our people as African Americans and people of color when it comes to on the economic playing ground. Are we better off now than we were in 1963, August 28, when they had the very infamous March on Washington, where there were over 250,000 people who march on the lawn on the Mall of Washington in front of the Lincoln Memorial. We want to talk about grade tonight. We'll have Mr. Casey to discuss that and talk to us about that and to see where we are today. Have we succeeded as a people economically or not? That's coming up. But before we do that, we want to acknowledge our wonderful producer and co-producers, one to be, by having a place here in Studio A here in the suburbs of Chicago in these beautiful studios. Let's open up with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you again for allowing us to be here on this last Monday in the month of August, the day before the historic, momentous March on Washington that took place 63 years ago. We thank you, Lord, that you've allowed us to speak about that on tonight. Bless us and keep us in your care. In the name of Jesus, we thank you and praise your name. Amen. But first up, I brought with me, as I often do, my homework, a list of some top past and present business people, man and woman, that we have seen and have heard about. Some of us, if you haven't, you'll hear it tonight. Did a listing of some great business people that have come before us, and some are with us now. Number one on my list is Arthur G. Gaston. And I thank God for Arthur G. Gaston. He was a serial entrepreneur, which simply means this man had a set of different businesses all across Birmingham, Alabama. He opened up a funeral home as well as burial insurance company, where he named it Booker T. Washington Insurance Company. As we know, Booker T. Washington was a strong proponent. Put him in the list too, that he was one of the people that pushed for businesses, not only educationally, but he was a business-minded person to pull together businesses. But anyway, Gaston later established the Citizens Savings and Loans Association. So the man had a knack for business when it comes to banking, and he had a knack for construction company. So he was a serial businessman, not a serial murderer, but a serial entrepreneur. And he had a financial institution, which was called CFS Bond Shares. He had the knowledge of investments. So you're talking about men today who've done investments, but don't forget about A.G. Gaston. So throughout the 1960s, Gaston was one of the richest black men in America and was the leading employer of blacks in Alabama. John H. Johnson, as you know him here in Chicago, who started Ebony and Jet magazine with the Negro Digest, was the predecessor of the Johnson's Ebony. So we know of John H. Johnson. What a great man he was. Then there's Reginald F. Lewis, who was listed in the Forbes 400 in 1992. Lewis was considered the richest black man in the 1980s, a graduate of Harvard Law School. George Foreman, he's just not a heavyweight boxing champion, but he is a businessman, a very shrewd businessman. How I know, and you know, he was one of the men, as we know, outside of the ring. We know about the George Foreman grills. And because of these George Foreman's grills, this has given him a hefty, Brother Earl, Sister Wanda B, a hefty income of $300 million because of his name being on the grill, the Foreman Grill, Sultan Incorporated. They paid him $137.5 million in 1999 for the rights to the Foreman's name and image. And again, today, that nets about $300 million. Oprah Winfrey was famously fired early in her career. Even she was fired. She was fired as an anchor in Baltimore's WJZ TV. Her boss labeled her an unfit for television news. Wow, what a major mistake. Today, that unfit, Brother Earl, is worth $2.8 billion. He said she was an unfit. I didn't know that until I researched it. Left Baltimore, came to Chicago, went from rags, went from disgust and ridicule to now worth $2.8 billion. There's another gentleman, Damon John, the man who had the clothing line, 1989. He also worked at Red Lobster during FUBU's first 6 years. He doesn't have to work for them anymore because Mr. John is worth $250 million. Isn't that great news? That's some good money, ain't it? That's what he's worth. Michael Jordan, legendary basketball player, but a shrewd businessman. He is now worth $1 billion. Okay? Not just for that basketball, but we just want to share that. But let me correct myself. Forbes just reported him, and this year he's got another $650 million. So he's worth 1.65 billion. And if I do my math correctly, that's about $1,650 million. Am I right or wrong? Okay. That ain't no $650,000. I believe that's about $650 million. So he's knocking on the $2 billion pretty soon. Now, this other couple, or was a couple, they're divorced now, but they sold BET, the Johnson family, Robert Johnson and Sheila Johnson, and they sold BET, and that's another whole show, another whole issue, but they sold it. So that put them in another category, Brother Earl and Sister Wanda B. That puts them at $2.9 billion. And that was 17 years ago. That's good money, ain't it? Now, here's another great story I found out. Janice Bryant Hyroyd. She owns her own conglomerate of employment agencies and consultancy, which means she consults And that's my ambition right now. My second business right now is to do what she's doing. And guess how much she's worth? She's on the New York Stock Exchange. She's worth $1 billion. Look out now. I'm not a fan of rapping, but I got to give it to these two brothers. The first one is Sean Diddy Combs. Sean Diddy Combs, Grammy Award winning album, No Way Out. Got Notorious B.I.G. involved in the business, but the brother is moving toward $1 billion. Right now, he's worth $820 million. Okay? Not a fan of Jay-Z. I'm not a fan of Beyonce, but you got to give them credit. I can't hate them. They together are worth together $290 million. And that number may be higher now. That was in 2017, since I last researched this. Okay? Now watch out. Dr. Dre. According to this information that I have here, the brand scored collaborations, endorsements, deals with various artists and athletes, and him partnering with other people with those headphones. Based on what I'm reading here, it was acquired by Apple for $3 billion in 2014. So that puts Dr. Dre in the billionaire club. Am I right or wrong? When you're dealing with Apple, and you know how much money Apple is worth today, Brother Earl, just wanted to be. Their company, the revenue, when you look at the sheets and look at, because I have an MBA degree, and based on the knowledge that I understand, and I saw this on television, they're $1 trillion company now. Apple, they're killing it. This is not a company led by African Americans, though. So we got to tighten up. I'm going to deal with that in a minute. Now, let me go back. Madam C.J. Walker, if she were alive today and had the money that she had back then, trust me, she would be knocking on $1 billion too. So that's a list of the money that we have individually, and that's not us working together. Just individually, we got some money in the African American community, Brother Earl. We got money. Now, but still we need to increase African American businesses. And I'm going to be calling our sponsor in a minute. He's another businessman, and I'm going to be helping him on some projects, and he can share that information over the phone with the listening audience, because I know that there are people that are listening and that I've sent out on Facebook information. They too can become business people. Doesn't make sense for us to continue working for the man every night and day, as Tina Turner will say. We need to own our own businesses. Diane Carroll said that. We got the integration down packed. That's not the problem anymore. The problem, Brother Earl and wannabe guys in the listening audience, is that we don't work together, and many of us don't own jack. We don't own nothing. So I got to go back. Before the March on Washington, we had it going on. 1863 to 1877 was one of the best times, if not the best times, for Black Americans, because we had some Union soldiers who were protecting us from the haters who were white men, I must confess, who were white men who were upset that now we are free, but we had protection. So we had a lot of African Americans who were not just elected to public office, but we had a lot of African American men who owned their own businesses during this particular time, long before the Jim Crow system of segregation came on the scene. And I got proof of that. So we had people like James Fortin, who was on the scene long before we were freed as Black people. This was a Philadelphia sail maker. Okay. In 1860 something, he's worth $100,000. Today, he would be worth $2.5 million if he were alive today. Samuel Wilcox became a wholesale, had his own grocery line, had grocery stores in Cincinnati. Now, these are our northern cities. If he were alive today, even with inflation, if adjusting the inflation, he would be worth $4.2 million. Okay? I'm going to keep moving because I got Mr. Casey coming on, our sponsor, because I want to give him adequate time. I got some questions I want to ask him because he's an expert. He's in the business arena. Now, the other two people on my list on this sheet, we got Paul Kufi. Paul Kufi was successful in the 18th century. And we're talking 1780 and 90. He was a sea captain, a businessman, long before the March on Washington. So what did they have? We'll talk about it. Stephen Smith. Smith grew up an indentured servant, meaning working for somebody else for his freedom in Pennsylvania as a young man. He bought his freedom for $50 at the age of 21. And he continued to work in the lumber yards, and the man began to own and did own his own lumber yard in 1822, long before the March on Washington. How? Listen to that. William Alexander Landendorf Jr. was one of America's most successful. He was a biracial businessman. He was a prominent figure in trade. He was successful at his own shipyard, his own lumber yard, his own ship chandlery shop, a real estate tycoon. We're talking the early to mid 1800s before slavery. And having built San Francisco's very first hotel, as well as having served as the city's first treasurer, he was noted as an American's first millionaire of black descent. Look at that. Long before the March on Washington. Today, the man would be worth $1.4 million. Okay? Got to keep moving. Long before the March on Washington, there was a man called Frank McWorthy. Frank McWorthy, an American slave who eventually, guess what? He bought his freedom. Free Frank became a saltpeter manufacturer and a businessman. He saw particularly high success during the War of 1812 when saltpeter was in high demand. And because of his success, he was able to buy the freedom not only for himself, but he bought the freedom of 16 people. So he looked out for other people. Why can't we do the same thing for the people today? You see 16 people today and you're a billionaire. How come you can't take your money, and I'm talking about these people I listed earlier, and help make them millionaires? Now, I'm not knocking on Oprah Winfrey. I think she's helping some people to get to be millionaires, but we can improve. Okay? So think about that one. Clara Brown, an ex-slave. Brown moved to Colorado in the 1850s during the gold rush and managed to establish a successful laundry business. And they tell me she owned 16 lots in Denver, 7 houses in Central City, and some other property and mines around Colorado. And we're talking about long before the March on Washington. Look at how we're doing here successfully. Okay. Now, the rise and fall of Black Wall Street. Even Dr. King said in April 3rd to be exact, the day before they assassinated him, he says, I've been to the mountaintop. He's talked about that in Memphis. And I remember listening to the CD or to the speech on YouTube, and he talked about the fact that he urged the people at Mason Temple who were listening, the garbage truck workers and other people. He said, you ought to pull your money out of those other banks and put your money in Tri-State Bank, a black-owned bank. And after he says that, ironic or whatever you want to call it, he was murdered the next day. But he was on the right track. He was talking about economic empowerment. And our guest is going to talk about that when he talks to us about his grandfather, who was a self-made millionaire, S.B. Fuller. We got to talk about that. Now, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker or our guest for tonight, and that will be Martin Casey. And then I'm going to give him a call, and then we've got some questions we want to ask him. Martin credits his mother, Mary Fuller Casey, for bringing him to Chicago in the 1980s to be a mentor under his grandfather's tutelage. After not doing well in college, Martin recalls his mother telling him that you may not make it in the professional world, but you can make it in the business world as your grandfather did. Father. He's the owner. Right now, Martin is the owner of a construction company. He owns his own car wash. He owns rental property. And he owns a Dudley distributorship. And recently, he reincorporated that. And that's now called, as we are giving blessings financially from this business, My Fuller Beauty Incorporated. He's the president and CEO of My Fuller Beauty Incorporated. My Fuller Beauty Incorporated is the vehicle he will use to recruit and train in the manner in which his grandfather built the company. He shares many Fullerisms that have helped him through the years, such as currently, Martin Casey is relaunching the Fuller product brand. Here it is, because he's going to talk about that tonight. And I will get him to go around to various churches and share that information. And he's truly excited about the manufacturing and the distribution of the product line. He is confident in the success of the relaunch while being aided and advised by Mr. Joe L. Dudley. And Mr. Dudley still lives. He's in his 90s now, and he's worth $30 million. Yes, Mr. Dudley. Martin's grandfather helped Mr. Joe Dudley get his start. So that's the connection there. And we're going to work hard to get him on the show eventually, Mr. Dudley. As you know, he has a beauty school here in Chicago, and many of his products are known all around the world. Again, he's doing well, even in his 90s, and he's worth $30 million. The Fuller line was distributed through direct sales, and the consumer benefited by getting quality products in the comfort of their own home. Over 6,000 sales were reported at one time, one Fuller products. And of course, his grandfather had over 6,000 employees, if my record serves me correctly, and he can share that information tonight. I might not be right on the money, but he definitely has had over that many employees that have worked for him over these many years that he lived. And he was born back in 1905, and we were just so blessed to have him around for 70 years or so. And I do have the book, and he'll share that information as well. Martin was one of those salespeople who worked, again, under the tutelage of his grandfather. And he credits the door-to-door experience and the courage needed to close many deals in the construction business. Martin has made decisions to make a difference in the world, just as his grandfather did so many years ago. So we're going to go ahead and call him just a few minutes ahead of schedule to see if he's available now.
Hello, you've reached Martin Casey. I'm away from...
We'll have to call him back, so I don't know. His voicemail came on, Earl, so we'll just keep on talking. Hopefully, he will be back with us. So give me 1 second. Okay, let's go ahead and take a real quick break. And again, you're listening to the Dream Makers 365. We'll be back in a couple of minutes.
is the time to prepare our hearts and minds and come before our King, boldly before his throne. I can't hardly wait to come into this blessed place and prepare a sacrifice of praise. Let us go into the house of God. Come Sunday, come and go with me. Come Sunday, there's rest for the weary, you can be free. Come Sunday, lay your burdens down. So come Sunday, we will meet on holy ground. Meet on holy ground. Oh, come Sunday, salvation for the soul in the church. Come Sunday, where the wounded can be whole. Oh, come Sunday, you won't ever leave the same. So come Sunday, we will glorify his name. Sunday morning, church bells ringing, the choir singing. It's a beautiful day. Every Sunday morning, I'm Sunday morning ready. Get my coat, where's my Bible? Come on, Sally, we don't want to be late. It's Sunday morning. Hurry Sunday morning, I'm Sunday morning ready. Shaking hands with the saints, folks coming from far and near. It's the body of Christ, it's the church. Sunday morning ready. Hurry Sunday morning, I'm Sunday morning ready. Bishop's preaching the message. It's a message of hope, a message of deliverance. Hurry Sunday morning. Sunday morning. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Sunday morning. Oh, Sunday morning. Hurry Sunday morning. I'm Sunday morning ready. Don't you wanna go Sunday morning? Oh yeah. Sunday morning. There's deliverance, there's freedom. Come taste and see. Oh, Sunday morning ready. Oh yeah. Sunday morning ready. Baptized in the name of Jesus Christ.
All righty, welcome back to Dreammakers 365, IntellectualRadio.com, a radio show. We're so glad that online, you can reach us online by going to the IntellectualRadio.com, even tonight, to listen to the show. We will be asking for callers if anyone who is listening would like to call in and share. If you were there, whether you were there at the march or around living during that time, what was it like compared to now, as far as economically speaking? Have we somehow, as a people, arrived since that day, that fateful day, I guess, in 1963, August 28th, on that infamous day, rather? How has it been? Have we arrived economically? What can we do if you believe we haven't? Those are the kinds of questions I wanted to ask anyone who is listening tonight. And again, I am going to make an attempt again in a minute to call our guest. We're not sure what has happened, but he definitely has been very busy with some business affairs and things of that nature. But feel free to call in. as we talked about. There were some great times in America even before the March on Washington, but we can certainly do better than what we've done here in recent years for sure. We have more wealth. Again, African Americans did not have the wealth that we have today, but yet and still, it seems to be where we are not necessarily working together to close the deal, which means we can do better, make America even great as a country where all of us have a part or can get a piece of the American dream. And that to me has not occurred yet. But we can beg her to differ. If there is anyone who would like to call in, whether you can come in, call in to agree with that or call in to disagree with that. But we've had people here in Chicago who have done great in this particular country, and we've had so many other people who have not fared so well in this great country. As I talked about early on, African Americans back in the times during slavery, we operated virtually every kind of company. But some of the most prominent black owned businesses have been in times past, have been in insurance companies. They've been in banking. They've even been in recording labels, funeral parlors as we know it, barber shops, beauty salons, restaurants, record stores, and bookstores. These are wonderful things that we've done. By 1920, there were tens of thousands of black businesses. A great majority of them were quite small. And we know that many of the businesses in our country today, the small businesses is what really keeps this country going in the first place. Small businesses. The largest were insurance companies. The league had grown so large that it supported numerous of offshoots, serving bankers, publishers, lawyers, as we had on our show last week. One of the great lawyers right here in Chicago and in our country, as we know it, he is doing wonderful with Bill Busters. And I think Ernesto Borges is doing a wonderful job. But we can still do better. Funeral directors, retailers, insurance agencies. The Great Depression from 1929 to 1939 was a serious blow as cash income fell in the black community because of very high unemployment. The same thing going on today. And many small businesses closed down. During World War II, many employees, owners switched over to high paying jobs and munition factories. Black businessmen generally were most conservative elements of their community, but typically did support the civil rights movement. As we know, A.G. Gaston supported Martin Luther King. There were no hotels in Birmingham, maybe a few that we're not sure of, but the one that I know about, A.G. Gaston's hotel or motel, supported Dr. King. He stayed at those hotels because of A.G. Gaston. That's a great reason why the civil rights movement was successful even in Birmingham. We don't talk about that because of his money, because of his charitable ability, because of that to help Dr. King to stay in these hotels. By the 1970s, federal programs to promote minority businesses activity provided new funding, although the opening world of mainstream management and large corporations attracted a great deal of talent. Black entrepreneurs, originally based in music and sports, diversified to build brand names that made for success in advertisement and media world. This is after the March on Washington. Okay, now listen, traveling posed its own challenges to integration. Whereas salons were typically segregated, whites and blacks could meet in the middle, but restaurants were socially regulated. Traveling black men would not be seated in town restaurants where black only establishment had not been established. That's something important. Requiring the black men to order food from the back door, most black cowhands would purchase the food and prepare it for themselves on the trail. Black men were banned outright from brothels, but welcome in gambling halls. So you had a mixed message of things going on there. But again, we're just excited about the fact that we've had some great successes and we've had some issues where they were not successful. Let me go ahead and attempt to call our speaker again and go from there and see if we can get him. If not, we're going to go ahead and finish up the show and keep on moving in that manner.
Hello, you've reached Martin Casey.
Yeah, he must be tied up tonight. So we're going to go ahead and just let you know that we were also contemplating, and we will do a show next week on the second FBI investigation centered around the Emmett Lewis Till murder. As you know, his death would be 63 years ago on tomorrow. So I didn't want to do two shows because we only have 1 hour. So this show is dedicated to the March on Washington, which I really believe, obviously, that march was held on August the 28th. That had a lot to do with the fact of his death to Brother Earl and Wanda B, which was August the 28th, 1955. And the March on Washington was held 8 years after his death in the 1963 year. So we're going to do a show next week entirely on him, and he will be our person of the week, Emmett Till, who grew up here in Chicago land and visited my home state in the summer around about this time. And we know that his murder took place around 2:30 a.m. on August the 28th in 1955. So we'll do that show. And my plan is to have, I've got two people in mind for the to be the guest. I won't make that decision until probably Wednesday to have a couple of guests, and one of them for sure I will have, and maybe have them to call in. There's some dynamite guests that we can get to do that. But again, our show tonight, our sponsor is Mr. Martin Casey, who is the president and CEO of My Fuller Beauty Incorporated. And again, he is scheduled tonight to actually be our speaker, but something must have happened, but that's okay. We're so glad, as I always do, Brother Earl, have enough information and material to carry on the show. So we know something must have happened, and I'll give him a call a little later, or he will do that. But again, our show is being sponsored by My Fuller Beauty Incorporated each week. Because of this gentleman, Martin Casey, we have this show. And again, next week, we will do a show on the life and discuss the second of two investigations with the FBI around the death of Emmett Lewis Till. So we thank you for tuning in with us on tonight as we get ready to sign out. And we will be back again on next week talking more about Dream Makers 365. And again, thank you for tuning in, listening to Dream Makers 365 on IntellectualRadio.com. God bless you. Have a great night. Stay safe out there, wherever you are in this great country of ours, the United States of America, or around the world, because we are truly world citizens and we ought to be at our best wherever we go. Have a good night.
And minds and come before